Okay then, hello everyone. I think perhaps I'll make a start now. So thank you for coming to our session. We're delighted to be here to give you an overview of the Centre for Disaster Protection's 7 Habits of Highly Effective Disaster Risk Financing. I'm going to start by letting you know that the session's recorded. It's going to be uploaded onto the global platform, and we're also going to use it at the Centre for our internal purposes. So many of you will be familiar with the idea of disaster risk financing, or DRF. It's financing that promotes and targets prevention, preparedness and response to crises. But today we're going to look at what makes good DRF. This is something that we at the Centre have thought a lot about, and it's culminated in our 7 habits of highly effective disaster risk financing. Today, we're running an interactive session. We're going to introduce each of these 7 habits, and we're going to ask you to draw on your experience to share thoughts about whether these habits have value in your own work and any challenges you might face. So the Centre and the Anticipation Hub are planning a knowledge share collaboration. We hope that today's session is going to inform that. During the session, we're going to ask you to keep yourselves muted. We'll rely mainly on the chat function on Zoom, and we were going to run a couple of Zoom polls, but I'm going to ask you to answer in the chat function today. Can I have the next slide, please, Dee? So let me start by introducing the Centre and ourselves. For those of you not familiar with the Centre, we find better ways to stop disasters devastating lives and economies by supporting countries to manage their risk better. Centres founded on the principle that the relative likelihood of a particular disaster can be predicted and that its impact can be managed with the right plans in place. So we're finding and we're sharing better ways to prepare for and respond to disasters. This can significantly limit the effect disasters have on people's everyday lives and on countries' long-term development. So I'm Joanne Mausch. I'm on secondment from the UK Government Actuaries Department, where I was heavily involved in learning and development. I'm leading the Centre's capacity building programme alongside Dee. So Dee is a principal consultant at the Centre and has many years' experience in the non-profit sector as an impact investment and disaster risk financing consultant. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please, Dee? I'm going to quickly go over what disaster risk financing is for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So this is what the Centre's work focuses on. It's seeking to address the problem that decisions about disaster finance are made mostly after a disaster. When this happens, the disaster response is often slow and it's insufficient and it might not be very well coordinated. This tends to be coupled with poor prevention and preparedness. However, if we put financing in place before a disaster strikes, this can glue response plans in place and it can promote risk prevention and preparedness. We'll talk about this a lot more in one of our habits later. I'm now going to pass to Dee, who's going to go into DRF a little bit more.
Hi everyone, sorry, let me just get it to the slide I need. It is great to have you all joining us today, and thanks Joanne for the intro. So let me just take a minute to put our 7 habits of highly effective DRF into context for you by exploring the spectrum of disaster risk finance. So as you can see on this slide, we have the full range of disaster risk management as a cycle or a spectrum, as we call it. And at the Centre, as Joanne mentioned earlier, we view disaster risk financing as a flexible approach. It's financing that promotes prevention, that promotes preparedness and response to crises. So in other words, we view DRF spanning this entire spectrum, as you can see on the slide. So let's just walk along this spectrum for a minute. We start with identifying your risks at the far left side. Those risks that you want to pay to prevent those risks that you want to reduce, those that you anticipate, and then those that you transfer out. If you can't reduce your risk to zero, we accept the residual risk and we prepare for it. And this is where anticipatory action comes in. Of course, once the shock has happened, then we're responding to the risk and rebuilding. Underpinning all of this, so that the bar that's going across the bottom of the slide, is preparedness and building capacity to anticipate and to manage emergencies so that we can transition smoothly from early action to response and to recovery. This is all disaster risk financing, and different financing instruments offer some benefit to the DRM process at each of these different stages. And you can see some of them, just a handful of them as examples listed here. I won't go into them. I know a lot of you will be very familiar with them. For example, forecast-based financing and START's anticipation window and ARC replica. Don't forget that some DRF solutions apply across these different stages. So for example, the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, the DREF fund, does forecast-based action and it does response loans. And another example of that would be insurance with phased triggers. So having defined what we mean by DRF and how we position it relevant to the work we're all doing in disaster management, I'll hand back to Joanne to talk us through our 7 habits in a little bit more detail. Over to you, Joanne.
Okay, thank you very much, Dee. So we're going to turn now to what we think, what the centre thinks makes good DRF. As I said before, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's culminated in our working list, the 7 habits, which are displayed on this diagram here. Our work, there's been a lot of good work in this area already, and what we've done aims to complement that. So for example, I'm going to ask someone to put a link in the chat to Insurer Resilience Pro-Poor Principles. Some of these habits are more neglected than others, and we've released some guidance notes around the ones we feel are overlooked. Again, hopefully a link will appear in the chat at some point. These guidance notes are aiming to provide very practical guidance, tools and examples of how to build the habits into DRF initiatives. We're actually expecting these habits to evolve as we learn more about what works and why. With this in mind, we're really keen to listen to the experience of others. I'd say now these habits aren't meant to be hierarchical. However, we're going to ask you, it would be interested in your thoughts about which one you consider most important. We haven't got the Zoom polling, so I'm going to ask you to just pop a note in the chat bar which habit you consider the most important, and perhaps let us know why. I give you a minute to do that.
And this is where I get a little nervous, because I'm quite excited to see what everybody thinks is the most important habit to them. If it was me, I wouldn't be able to decide. I'd have to actually say all of them, although I do have a favorite. So let's see what you all think.
And I think perhaps sometimes it's about the habit which might get overlooked. So I think perhaps 7 of them are equally important. But perhaps sometimes we need a reminder, we sometimes have to focus on the 1 or 2 we might forget. Thank you, Cara. Yes, I mean, I'm fairly new to DRF, and the thing I keep getting reminded about is clear line of sight to the poor and the vulnerable, focus on poverty. And again, I would say number 4 very much links to that. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, creating power, definitely. That seems fairly popular. Yeah, focus on poverty, aligning with the big picture. I think maybe the message here is the chain's only as strong as the weakest link. Shall we move on to the next slide then? Thank you for that. So having a look at habit number 1, effective DRF focuses on poverty. Okay, this next section here is going to be fairly formulaic. We're going to give you a brief overview of a habit, and then we're going to ask you a question or two to try and get your input, get you to share your experience. So starting with habit number 1, effective DRF focuses on poverty. As you know, disasters tend to have the biggest impact on those who are least able to protect themselves from them. In most cases, the vulnerable are also the poorest in society. DRF has a very powerful potential here. It can protect poor households by securing timely, pre-agreed payments to governments and organisations in low and middle-income countries. But this isn't automatic. DRF needs to be directed at the types of risk that affect poor households, needs to be directed to the households most affected, and it needs to be directed when they need the support. Alternatively to directing at households, we can seek to re-establish the disrupted services and markets that the poor households most rely on. Where we're looking to support households, where we're looking to support the households directly, we need to think about targeting those vulnerable households and getting the funds to them quickly. The timing of support's important. It's actually going to be our next key habit. But we should know that the funds, the support, aren't necessarily always needed at the same time. So sudden onset disasters should be treated differently from slow onset. Okay, I'd also say we should think about all these issues at the time of designing the disaster risk financing. And a key thing to remember is just because something worked in one context doesn't mean it will work in another. I think if we move on to the next slide, this is the first of our question slides. I've got 2 questions up there. I've got, in the countries you have experience in, what are the priority risks for poor households? And also, where do you see these priority risks unmet, and why do you think this is? I mean, they're quite specific questions. We are very interested in hearing about your experience around the questions, so please do feel free to comment a little bit wider on this. I think perhaps we want to, this question is asking us to focus on the risk, not necessarily the need it causes. So I don't know, Dee, if you think an example here would be an earthquake rather than the resulting homelessness.
Yeah, and I think I'd add another point as well, Joanne. It's a bit of an obvious one, but I think an important one for us to reiterate, and that is that disaster risk isn't just about how vulnerable the poorest are to a specific hazard, as you're saying, such as drought, but about their capacity to manage that risk and their level of reserves that they already have in their households. So we're talking about the types of shocks that are those that poor households cannot recover from easily by either using their savings, by depending on friends and family and borrowing from them, selling some assets maybe, but just coping mechanisms that they would have within their, I guess, their menu of options in their household anyway. It's the risks that push them beyond that we're really interested in exploring here. Oh, you're on mute, Joanne.
So the word covariate was used in the guidance note, and if I remember correctly, that was basically more support is needed where kind of a disaster strikes all households in the area. They're less likely to be able to help themselves. So kind of in my mind, that was making me think that's why the focus is on disasters, and kind of rather than perhaps death of a main breadwinner. Would that be a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, definitely. And Sophie has put that link into the chat so that everyone can go and follow up and do a little bit more reading themselves on the paper. It's got some great practical guidance in there as well about how to actually deal with this issue when designing disaster risk financing instruments.
Fantastic, thank you. I would say there's some very good examples in that guidance note. We haven't had any comments on that one. Thank you, Sophie, for that link. I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Okay, so moving on to habit number 2, effective DRF is timely. Simply put, disaster risk finance should provide support when it's needed. This might be before a crisis. An important part of a very important part of this is ensuring the financing is triggered at an appropriate time for the actions it's intended to fund. So perhaps an example would be a drought. Financing is triggered when food for livestock becomes scarce rather than after the livestock has started dying. Can we have the next slide, please? So let's consider the triggers further. The aftermath of a disaster is often chaotic. Response systems may struggle to react quickly. Political interests come into play, and because of all this, we might get suboptimal results. Or if we plan before the disaster strikes, we can have a faster, more coordinated, and more effective response. So important in this planning is putting a trigger in place, and the idea is that the trigger will activate both a contingency plan, a response plan, and the associated finance that goes with it. When the trigger is met, the financing becomes available and the response plan is launched. So one example, not necessarily in a humanitarian context, was the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. The government had actually, before this happened, signed a contingent service contract with a construction company. So that was for post-disaster reconstruction. Through this and similar contracts, the highways were actually rebuilt within a couple of weeks. So there's another, if we move on to the next slide, we've got a question here about the challenges you might have seen in your work around triggers and contingency plans. I'm going to open this up a little bit wider and ask kind of what triggers, what contingency plans have you actually seen, or even what are you aware of? Kind of, is this something we see an awful lot of? I mean, have you seen bad examples? Have you seen good examples?
Hopefully everyone's going to say forecast-based financing.
The obvious one. Brilliant. ARC's a great example, and I'd thoroughly, this is a lengthy guidance note which goes with this. I would thoroughly recommend reading it though. It's got a lot of interesting information there, some brilliant examples. I think it talks about ARC and ARC Replica in a couple of places. I have a potential example where it didn't work so well. So I think in 2015 there was an ARC payment to Niger, but it took 6 months to pay out because I think, if I understand correctly, the payment triggered, but there was no distribution mechanism in government, and I think the Prime Minister might have had to personally intervene to get the money out.
Yeah, and I mean that, Joanne, that to me is a great example of something that we talk about very frequently, which is the political bias that's there in not only DRF instrument design, but specifically with triggers. There are many countries still where we have to wait for a formal declaration of emergency before any money can be released from the national coffers. So I think being able to take out that politicization and that potential political bias in the design of a DRF instrument is critical.
Okay, shall we move on to the next habit? I would say do please pop anything in the chat. So obviously answer the questions we're asking, but you know, if you've got any thoughts on the habits, you think one is particularly valuable or perhaps one isn't quite so important, then please do feel free to pop that in the chat. So our habit number 3 is effective DRF improves constantly. Again, this is something you're probably very familiar with. Because DRS is a new area, initiatives should aim to constantly track their performance and find ways to improve. So feedback loops are incredibly important here. This can happen through technical scrutiny at key points to track performance. It can also happen by embedding monitoring and evaluation, M&E, in the actual system. Independent review at multiple stages is really important for DRF approaches and for the instruments. It should happen at the design, and it should happen once the project's underway. It can provide an accountability function. There's a lot of money being spent here. We should be accountable. And it can also facilitate learning, help us get better at what we do. The impact of monitoring and evaluation is greatest when the information on performance is publicly shared. This can be really hard though. No one likes to admit if they've got things wrong or could do things better. Unfortunately, most DRF evaluations aren't widely available, and it's limiting global learning in this area. If we had more data, we had more information in the public domain, we could make sure it's not just individual DRF projects that are constantly improving. We could improve it on a global level. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question now. So a bit of an obvious question. Can we ask you, please, when did you last read or use an evaluation? And what we're trying to gauge here is whether you think we're learning as a sector, whether we're learning from this experience, or whether repeating the same mistakes, whether we're carrying out monitoring and evaluation as a tick box exercise, or whether it's actually an important part of the process.
And also, Joanne, whilst everyone's thinking about that question, our colleague Zoe, who wrote the paper, talks about one very important aspect that we love, again, to talk about in the centre, and that is the importance, the value of a diverse team and teamwork. And so when she's writing the paper, which again we'd encourage you to read because it has some practical guidance in there, she talks about designing M&E frameworks that bring in a multitude of different skill sets. So that means economists, actuaries, humanitarians, public financial management experts, social protection specialists, GESI specialists, so gender and equality specialists, and putting them all together to create one very comprehensive M&E framework at the beginning, and then, as Joanne said, have the ability to check back halfway through your program, and then again at the end, and then with follow-up after that to embed the learning. So there are some really interesting points in that paper which we'd highly recommend having a read of as well.
That's a brilliant point, Dee, thank you. So kind of with disaster risk financing, you need the range of skills to do DRF, but you also need the range of skills to assess DRF. Jen's put a really good comment in the chat about organising CDRFI Evidence Roadmap Workshop, and it's actually available online. So I'm going to certainly have a look at that afterwards.
Brilliant, Jen. That's really useful. Thanks for that. Great input. So I think in the interest of time, I will move on now and talk about habit number 4. So please, my esteemed colleagues, tell me if anyone is writing in the chat so that I can answer them, because I can't see the chat, unfortunately, on my screen that I have open. So bear with me on that one. But let's look at habit number 4. And it's about creating power for people facing risk. Now, I know this is a popular one. It's definitely one of my favorites. I have 2 that tie for favorite positions, so I can't say that it's my absolute favorite, but it is a critical habit that we need to embed in all of our DRF solutions. The best DRF puts power in the hands of at-risk people and communities, giving them the choice over how they manage their own risks. Ensuring the inclusive participation of people in DRF is essential, but obviously very challenging in some cases. And I'll ask you about the challenges that you've experienced or faced in a second on another slide. As we know, it takes time and investment to build understanding and trust amongst DRF stakeholders, with sometimes very different and diverging incentives and viewpoints. Examples of empowering DRF include prioritizing the use of country-owned safety nets that work well, and it incorporates the meaningful participation of the most vulnerable to shocks in government DRF programs during not only the design, but also the implementation and the M&E phase as well. So involving and the participation of at-risk communities across the spectrum of program design is critical. So why is the engagement and empowerment of at-risk communities so important? Well, we believe it's for an overarching 3 different reasons. The first is for sustainability. DRF programming that overlooks the nuances of vulnerabilities that at-risk communities face ends up being a mismatch between their actual needs and the modeled risks and financing triggers on the other hand. This risks the perpetuation of inequality and disadvantage within that DRF solution or program. And it results in a complete lack of trust and very little ownership by that at-risk community. It enhances, as a second point, transparency and legitimacy and embeds ownership, like I was saying. For example, involving at-risk communities in ex-ante DRF contingency planning that takes place before the disaster happens enables community to have more time and more space to define their own needs and their own anticipatory actions. It gives them more time to question and also to challenge the contingency plans that are being designed to protect them. And that in that way, it builds trust and collective ownership. Who pays for what becomes clearer when you go through that process. Who takes responsibility for the ownership also becomes clearer when you go through that process with at-risk communities. And the third point I wanted to make is that engaging communities in the design of DRF solutions increases their technical efficiency as well and their effectiveness. So critically, the development of intricate vulnerability metrics that feed into these DRF models happen very commonly at a distance from the realities and the nuances faced by at-risk households on the ground. And that leads to a greater risk of inaccuracy in the model that underpins the DRF solution or program. So for example, a drought risk model that only inputs the cash crop of a country as the reference crop and not the staple crop of that country that poor communities rely upon means that the food security vulnerability of at-risk communities is not accurately portrayed in the model. And as a result, humanitarian assistance of affected people is inaccurately skewed. So I have a question now for you. What do you think is the biggest challenge you've experienced with the inclusion of at-risk communities directly in your disaster management work? I know that's a very broad question because there are many, but I'm going to start you off with a couple that I actually think are sometimes a big challenge. One is actually the diversity of vulnerability itself. Many women, for example, have a different resilience to disasters than men based on their daily realities. So they have different perception levels of risk within the household. They have different work patterns, they have different education levels, they have different asset ownership. And so accessing disaster relief support is often more challenging for those who are marginalized due to their cultural traditions, their gender, their ability or disability, and their perceived social status. And another one that I would say is also a challenge is actually around financial literacy. You know, the starting point for at-risk community involvement and participation is very often just exposure to education on DRF concepts and ideas. Learning takes time, we know that. The translation of complex vulnerability models and complex indices that underlie DRF instruments is a challenge, but there's nothing to say that we can't do it, and we need to do it. So that is a starting point for me for bringing at-risk communities into the discussion and giving them the opportunity to be involved from start to finish. So I'm not sure, I think I'm probably blabbering on too much about one of my favorite habits. So if there are no comments on that, please feel free to stick them in the chat anyway, even after I've moved on to the next slide, but I will do that to keep us moving on these and keep us moving on time. So habit number 5 is about creating a trusted guarantee. If it's unclear whether people will receive support when there's a crisis, they alter their behavior and their coping mechanisms accordingly. If the crisis doesn't occur, without confidence in in that support arriving when it's needed, households will lack the peace of mind to make the right investments, such as their children's schooling or investing in their livelihoods at the beginning of the growing season. This quiet cost of uninsured risk that occurs every year, whether disasters occur or not, has a substantial impact on households' ability to move out of poverty. Great DRF gives households the confidence that they will be covered should a crisis develop. It provides certainty of support, and it builds confidence through the strengthening of the social contract between the government communicating clearly and proving over time that it will be there to support its people through safety nets or other similar mechanisms. So my question for you on this one is, how could creating a trusted guarantee change behaviors or coping mechanisms for the better? And what experience have you had of those? And again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to write some things in the chat. But whilst you are, I will just think about the difficulty between, it's not a difficulty, it's the interesting dynamics of having that trusted guarantee in place, and then sometimes what even the adverse effect of it may be. So for example, creating a trusted guarantee allows at-risk communities to take risks they otherwise wouldn't. So as we said just a minute ago, investing in their livelihoods, investing in their children's education. But on the flip side, the word trusted is actually critical here, because even if you have the guarantee in place, and you want to move forward with your coping strategies, if the trigger fails and the protection does not come through, then it's not a trusted mechanism, and your loss can be even greater without the prearranged system in place. So that's just an interesting flip side of the coin on having the guarantee in place, but also having a trusted guarantee in place, and how it can be, in fact, very detrimental if there is no trust there. So I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to move on very quickly to habit number 6. This is about creating good value in DRF. And I think critically here, what we mean by good value is, or value for money, we mean reaching more people and saving more lives with the same money, rather than reaching the same number of people at lower cost. And so here we're also talking about the potential trade-offs that have to be made between, for example, reducing risk and managing risk. Which of those represents better value? And I'm very sure that you will have come across this in your work many times, and in many cases have had to make quite tough choices about which one to prioritize. But let's look at some of the backup that says investing in disaster risk reduction is actually, in many cases, sometimes more beneficial. So the recent paper by IFRC on climate smart DRR actually quantifies that and says that every dollar spent on disaster risk reduction saves over $16 on the cost of response and recovery. So there you have some actual numbers to put to it. But this one, I know value for money discussions can open up Very many interesting points and follow-up, which unfortunately we don't have time for today. So I'm going to please do invite you again to write your ideas in the chat. Have you experienced those trade-offs? What have been the challenges with those trade-offs? And I will move on to telling you about habit number 7, another one of my favorites. Habit number 7 is about aligning with the bigger picture. And this one for me is critical because DRF should never happen in a vacuum. DRF projects have to take into account other risks, including long-term changing risks from climate change, and critically, they need to build on pre-existing approaches and systems and strategies that already exist in a country context so that we can build broader resilience. So an example would be a DRF initiative that aligns with the government's DRF strategy and disaster risk management policy that may utilize systems that already exist, like social protection systems, and that builds in ways of reducing risk rather than just responding to it. So what does that actually look like? These are the 4 components that we talk about when we're thinking about well-aligned DRF strategies. The first is about prioritizing risks. Whether you are a country government or a local municipality, a humanitarian organization, or an individual community member, you're facing multiple risks at the same time. By starting with a disaster risk assessment, you can map those risks out for yourself and have an open discussion about who owns them and then who makes the tough decisions about which ones to prioritize over others based on different criteria. For example, financial loss and human suffering. The second one is about alignment of DRF, and this is absolutely critical to avoid duplication and inefficiency in the system, in the wider ecosystem. So for example, the targeting of 2 different initiatives may actually end up delivering aid to the same disaster affected household, which is fine if that was intended at the beginning when you were designing the instrument, but in many cases that was not intended and happens very often by mistake. DRF instruments should be designed to complement each other. For example, instruments that are designed to finance emergency response should not inadvertently encourage disinvestment in disaster risk reduction. They should incentivize that. So often different instruments rely upon the same data systems, such as vulnerability targeting, for example. So we should see a greater pooling of resources to bring together all of these different systems that different instruments are relying upon. Why are they doing that? It doesn't make sense. There's not going to be alignment in a position where you have 3 different insurance products in country, all relying on a slightly different definition of vulnerability and a different map of vulnerability, and therefore potentially having overlap and impacting the same communities twice, which becomes extremely confusing for everyone involved. DRF programs should be properly integrated into longer term planning and policies. It takes a long time for DRF programs to mature to their full effect. So we need to include them in long-term planning so that we're giving them the best chance to deliver their greatest impact, whilst also supporting other goals, such as climate change plans or poverty reduction plans. So my question for you on habit number 7 is, do you think that we're well aligned in what we have out there and in place already in the system? It's kind of a rhetorical question, because from what I just said, you can already guess what the answer would be, in my opinion, certainly. But maybe you've seen some examples of actually some great alignment out there, which I'd also be really keen to hear about. The one I was kind of alluding to before about having different insurance policies in place in the same country is actually Kenya. And as many of you will know, Kenya's moved away from having these disparate DRF solutions that are all targeting drought-affected households to having one overarching DRF strategy in place for the country, including laws in place to enforce it and enforce the financing that we need to put aside in order to fund those responses and early responses specifically to drought-affected households. And it's a great example of trying to align social registries, trying to align vulnerability databases and information sources, and working very much together to create a system that has less fragmentation and less duplication in it. So that would be one that I would really encourage you to look at in more detail. And please do read the guidance note on this. It's brilliant, written by our colleague Felix, and hopefully one of my colleagues will put it into the chat for you as well, so that you can link to that directly. So a very, very quick whistle-stop tour for you today of what the 7 habits of highly effective DRF are. As Joanne mentioned in her introduction, this is currently a working list, so we do expect it to evolve over time. And would love you to also follow that evolution. So please feel free to sign up to our newsletter. And someone will put that in the chat for you as a link. And if there are any questions that have arisen from this incredibly quick tour of the 7 habits, I'm sure there are, or any that you feel we didn't answer or even didn't raise, then please feel free to send us an email to info@disasterprotection.org. Someone will put up the correct email address into the chat for you, and we would be very delighted to receive any emails or inquiries that you also might have. But before we finish, I just want to run the same poll again to see whether anyone has changed their opinion of what the 7 habits might be. So I think that Alison is going to just put back into the chat, or perhaps you can scroll back up to the top where we had the original 7 habits listed. Brilliant, thanks Alison. And tell us whether you have changed your mind, or whether you still rank them the same. What would be your the most important one for you in your work today? Mine obviously haven't changed. Great point, Joanne. Which ones are overlooked? Yeah, 7 most definitely, 4 most definitely, 1 and 2 as well.
I think they might be the 3 which came up right at the start.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So that's good. That's good. It means we've all got conviction in our views, right? I don't think we were going to change our minds too much, but definitely the ones that we feel have been overlooked, we have written guidance notes for, to just explore them in a little bit more detail. So those are on the website, and as I've said, the links are already in the chat function for you to follow up on. So, very last ask. Before we run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been brilliant to have you all part of this session. We hope that we have imparted some interesting thought processes that you can now go away and mull over and think about how you can apply these 7 habits to your own disaster risk management work. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. So Alison, I think, is going to put up some feedback, just 2 feedback questions, brilliant, in the chat. We are constantly evolving this session, and we'd love to know, did this meet your expectations? And also feel free to just jot down some other thoughts. If it didn't, why? If it did, why? And then the second question is, what would you like to see more of in this session? Now, albeit we've had a very short time frame to quickly run you through the 7 habits. Let's say if we had more time, what would you like to see? Would you like to see, for example, more interactivity, more case studies and examples, some specialist topics, maybe some deep dives into, say, social protection or public financial management, or just more opportunity for discussion amongst the group? We would love to hear your thoughts too. So again, even if you have thoughts after the session, please don't hesitate to send them to the info@ email address, and we will record them and embed them in our learning for taking this session forward in its next guise. So Joanne, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Nothing else from me. Very keen to hear if someone thinks of something after the session, then please do drop us an email. Very happy to follow up on questions if you want to send them to the same email address. But thank you all. Thank you for coming to the session. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. And look at that, we finished early, Genius. I was convinced I was going to run over. And all that is to be said is have a brilliant rest of the conference. Hopefully I will see you guys at other sessions, and have a great end of the year. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Bye.